Welcome to Power of the Mind, where we give you simple tools to help you improve your relationship with yourself and with others. In today's episode, we talk about love. Springtime is in the air here in Prescott, Arizona, in the United States, and we talk about what spring means, what love means, how relationships work, how we pick our partners, and a host of other really interesting material. Hope you enjoy it today.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Talking Glass Media and Cast 11.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm awesome.
It's my favorite part of the week. How about you?
My favorite part too.
So we're back with Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare and he hates when I say this, but the all-knowing Greg Struve. I feel like he reads my mind. That's like Chris Angel, like he's got magic going on. So, we've glad to have you back.
I'm glad to be here.
You were gone. Did you go out of town last week?
Yeah, I did. I went over. We have an orphanage that my wife and I have spent some time working on in Kenya, and we went to visit that. So it was kind of fun.
Wow. Well, I went to Vegas, so I mean, it's not really the same thing. But I did have kids with me, so that's probably the same, close.
Yeah,
but
same thing.
A bunch of other people's
More or
kids.
less. Yeah.
What are you going to do? So we've been talking a lot about families, a lot about family dynamics. It is springtime. So
Love is in the air.
Love is in the air. Birds are singing and butterflies are flying.
For love in all the wrong places.
How long do we get over there that we can just sing, just do our thing?
We have 8 seconds before we're into copyright.
No royalties?
Stuff. Yeah, we're royalty free for 8 seconds.
Awesome. Well, I'm down. I could go on all day with those. But my question to you, so we've talked about all the kids. We talked about the, lost child and the scapegoats and all of that and family dynamics and how all that works.
Yeah.
Where does it all begin?
Oh, yeah. It's really fun to theorize about that stuff and try to discern, how do relationships happen, because there's some really easy patterns to pick up. One of the sayings that I've heard that I really like is you tend to marry one and become the other when it comes to your parents, right? We tend to marry one and become the other. Now, that's not, I don't think, empirically or scientifically true. But in terms of personal experience, it certainly seems to show up a lot. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk to clients sometimes and I'll say, well, a lot of the time we'll have... We'll be in a relationship and decide it's not working, and we leave and we say, I'm going to date somebody completely different than that last person. And then we move on to somebody and they are actually a little bit different. And then we'll look back and we'll realize that the one person was a lot like my mom and the next one was a lot like my dad, for example, right? And I'll say, if you go back over your long-term relationships in your life, you'll often find you go from one to the other, etc. That's a pattern that people pick up sometimes, but you do see that sometimes. So it's really interesting to look at it in terms of how and why we pick who we pick, and there's a lot of different theories out there. My favorite is probably a variation of the one developed by Harville Hendrix in the 1980s, and a guy named Stan Tatkin kind of picked up the baton from Harville Hendrix more recently in the 2010 zone. And they talk a lot about the idea of taking a look at our parents and deciding that we have some unmet needs in childhood we try to get met through our primary relationships. And that's the basic idea fundamentally behind it. I think if we really got down to it, I always like to look at things from a survival and kind of evolutionary psychology perspective. And if we think about it, for a long, long time, living to adulthood was sort of rare. Not the majority of people born became adults. The Romans, I've talked about this on the show before, the Romans waited until kids were 6 years old to name them because the mortality rate was pretty high. And frankly, every once in a while in the Roman Empire, they'd have a kid and they'd decide, we're not going to keep this one. And they'd put the kid out in the trash for real. Wow. And the father had sole authority over that. The mom didn't have any choice in the matter, and the child was born. And there is a letter I read one time of a Roman general writing back to his wife and saying, if it's a boy, keep it, and if it's a girl, throw it out. So life was pretty cheap back in history, and we forget that now when we have an infant mortality rate that's measured in, I think it's per 10,000 or per 100,000. They measure the infant mortality rate for first world countries. Back in the day, the mortality rate when somebody went into labor was 1 in 4. Right? 1 out of 4 times, mom would die, kid would die, or both would die. So that's a pretty big deal. We've
That's
really come a
scary.
long way in that regard. When we think about that, as little organisms, 90% of your personality is put together between the ages of 0 and 6. By the time you're 6, you're pretty much going to be you, more or less. There's some variation that gets attached to it, and you develop different skills for relating inside your family versus outside your family. By the time you're 6, you're about ready to be who you are. You learn who and how to be by observing the adults in your environment, which makes sense because the adults in your environment, the biggest thing they have in common with one another and you is that they're not dead. Basically, your parents lived long enough to make you. So biologically, your mind is going to watch them and be like, I'm going to act like them. I'm going to do what they do. Your biology, I think we've said this on the show before as well, your biology doesn't give a crap if you're happy. It just wants you to be alive. Happiness comes after you're alive. It's pretty far down on the list of priorities after things like food, water, and not death, basically. And so the fact that your parents are alive, we will often seek to replicate their behavior or replicate the relationship that we witness simply because on a biological level it looks pretty attractive because it kept them alive and it kept us alive long enough to get out of the house too. So sometimes I'll have a parent who maybe is not particularly pleasant, and I'll find myself still attracted to people like that. And that's part of why.
That's interesting because I have my granddaughter is 6, and she's becoming this like super awesome human being, and I just really dig her. So when you said that, I was like, cool, because if this is who she's going to be, this is this is going to be great for her. But that, I mean, I always go back to that family dynamic where, you know, I want to take credit. You know, everybody around us wants to take credit for how amazing Emma is. Sure. But what about that kid that's rotten? You know, do you take, like, that kid's bad. And obviously, I probably had something to do with it because the kid is terrible, you know?
It's a tough thing. You know, Freud was notorious and got a kind of a bad rap for blaming particularly the mothers.
Yeah, it's always the mom.
And the mom. The maternal guilt. One of my favorite Facebook memes is Good Mom Bingo. And it's all these sort of tongue-in-cheek things about what you're supposed to do as a parent, you know, or Bad Mom Bingo. And it's one of the things is didn't savor every moment today. You know, didn't live in the, and it just has all these different like things you're supposed to do. The list of obligations that parents have toward children now is really, really high. And you only have to go back about 100 years to the point where, you know, your list of obligations for children was pretty short. You know, you just had to provide them with a place to live and feed them most of the time. And everybody was like, hey, great job. Mm-hmm. And that, again, is demonstrating how significantly the world has changed in the last couple hundred years. Prior to that, if you could feed your kids, you were doing great. Yeah. Everybody was pretty excited about it. A lot of the time anyway. And again, obviously that wasn't the case in all places all the time, but there was a lot more poverty prior to the Industrial Revolution, and we spent a lot of time trying to get the earth to grow us enough food to survive for a year or two at a time, and it's hard. Yeah. It's a lot harder than we give it credit for now with all of our modern opportunities and options developmentally. So yeah, that's where we pick our partners. We come up with a lot of times the wounding that we receive in childhood, we will try to resolve in our partners. So if I had a distant or absent dad, I might seek out a distant or absent, you know, if I'm attracted to men, I might seek out a man who is distant and absent and try to garner his attention and affection in the way that I was unsuccessful in garnering from my own father. So that's a really common thread, for example. Or if there's something that's happened in my life as a kid that I want resolution for, I'll seek that out, that resolution in my primary relationship. And what happens when we first get into the relationship, we go into the honeymoon stage where everything's great and we love each other and there's lots of sex and happiness and joy and our brain releases a neurochemical set of basically a dopamine boost in our brain that we can't replicate with drugs, at least not for the length of time that it happens in the honeymoon stage. Honeymoon stage is typically 6 months to 2 years, and it is a powerful, powerful experience biologically. And it's really designed biologically to take two people who don't have a lot in common and bond them together, sort of in a long-term basis. That whole falling in love thing chemically is pretty remarkable. You feel better looking, you act better than you normally would, and you just feel great. You tend to be actually quite a bit more attractive to other people during that stage, so that's interesting too. But then after 6 months to 2 years, the honeymoon wears off and we get into the power struggle. And the power struggle stage usually lasts about 7 years, give or take. Sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, and it sucks. It's just not fun at all. And what happens is the partner in front of me who I really liked, I'll pick somebody who's my opposite usually, or offsets some of my own stuff. So somebody who's shy will often hook up with somebody who is really outgoing. And at first, it's really a relief to have somebody who balances me out. Right. But after a while, it gets kind of annoying. So the same stuff I fell in love with somebody about becomes the stuff that drives me crazy about them.
Well, I don't think people change.
Really fun fact, too. The Gottman, there's two people, I can't remember his first name now. John Gottman, I think. John Gottman and his wife, Sandy is her name? I can't remember, but they have done a ton of studies over the course of 30, 35, 40 years up in Oregon on marriage and relationships. And from the time you get married to the 10-year mark, 70% of the problems are the same.
Yeah, I would imagine.
The 70% of the arguments are the exact same. Mm-hmm. What changes isn't the argument. What changes is your tolerance for the behavior.
Yeah, because things you found endearing, you know, in the first 2 years are now super annoying.
Super annoying.
I'm going on 32 years in a few weeks. So, but it is, I noticed that.
You must have gotten married when you were 12.
Yeah, just before then. I think we were betrothed at birth. I think that's what it was. But for me, it was like, you said the 2 year mark, and I was like, I noticed like right at that 2 year mark, that's when it was like, oh, this is never going to work.
Sure.
Like, it's never going to work.
What have I done?
What have we done?
Yeah.
You know, so
who is this crazy person? What do I do?
But he is definitely the same guy today that I married 32 years ago. So, I think we've kind of adapted a little bit to each other, you know, and I really think I've changed more into his personality than he has into mine.
Sure.
Just because he's a little more stubborn in his ways as far as, you know, being social or things like that. So it's just, you know, if you can't beat him, join him type of thing. And, but we found a good, you know, rhythm that works. But I think for all those people out there, it's like, oh, you know, he does this and this, and it drives me a little bit crazy, but I'll change him. Girl, not going to change him. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, people don't change very often, do they?
No, adapt maybe, but changing.
Once in a while, things will shift around a little bit. You know, somebody will have a midlife crisis or something like that, and then things can shift around. But it's the exception rather than the rule, and it tends to change in ways that aren't very predictable.
So you brought up dopamine.
Oh, yeah.
So, and with it being
there's a bunch of them, actually. Dopamine's sort of a shorthand for it. There's, I think, a half dozen, probably even more than that, but the ones that I know of involved in love. Oxytocin's a big one. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. There's
so you think there's people that are addicted to falling in love?
Oh, yeah.
And will self-sabotage the relationship?
Oh, for sure. We call it sex and love addiction.
Oh,
okay. There's all kinds. There's sex addiction, which is just addicted to the act of sex. The partner is fairly interchangeable, and you know, if the partner happens to be socially desirable, so much the better. But it really is just the act of sex that they're addicted to. Then you can have love addiction, where the relationship is what they're addicted to, and the sex part they could take or leave. Right? It's fine if it's there, but if it's not, that's fine too. And the sex and love addicts tend to be folks who are serial relationshipers. They get in, and they're excited about the relationship and excited about the high of being connected. They tend to have a lot of shame, and they see themselves through the eyes of the other person. So as soon as the other person doesn't look at them, you know, like they hung the moon, they really can't handle the conflict, and they tend to take off. There's different varieties within that too. But yeah, absolutely, people get addicted to love. So. Like, is it Robert Palmer who sang that song?
It was.
Might as well face it, you're dead. I'm showing my age there.
5, 4, 3.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
That's true.
We made it into our 8
that's
seconds.
the legal rule. Only
can't be sending Robert Palmer any money.
No money for you, Robert.
Yeah. So it's interesting because everybody loves to be in love.
Yeah.
But what replaces that? So you lose that dopamine. What is keeping,
Nothing.
There's nothing. It's just hard work and it's like we're staying together and that's it, or, because it's
during the power struggle, there is a certain degree to which, we can do couples counseling and try to learn to communicate effectively. There are, the Gottman folks talk about, they call it the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. One of the ones that I remember offhand is disgust. So this movement I'm doing right now, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but I'm raising awesome. this part of my lip up by my nose. I'm curling up one side of my face. That's the face of disgust. Ew. Disgust. Disgust is a precursor to a lot of bad things in human behavior. Actually, if you want to convince a large population of people to go to war or to commit genocide, one of the first things you need to do is create a sense of disgust toward the other group of people. People don't attack and kill people out of fear or anger, but rather disgust tends to be the big one. If you look at a lot of Hitler's propaganda during the 1930s, we were really talking about seeing the Jews as, I can't remember what the word was now, but definitely less than people. Or the genocide between the Tutsis and the Hutus in Rwanda. They referred to each other as cockroaches, as insects, as less than human. But in relationship, we have a tendency to do that, right? If I feel like somebody's not meeting my needs for a long period of time, eventually I may decide that they're a bad person, right? There's a thing called, this is fun to talk about. On the disgust topic, the Gottmans talk about a thing called negative sentiment override, which is kind of a fancy way of saying, so there's 3 sort of ways you can categorize what's coming out of the mouth of your partner or their behavior. You can either say that behavior is, positive, it's neutral, or it's negative. In the beginning of the relationship, we're in positive sentiment override. So what that means is when a sentiment or either a behavior or a phrase or set of words or sentences comes from that person to me, if it's positive, I think, she's so great. That makes a lot of sense. Based on her character, of course she's going to say that nice thing. And if it's negative, I give her the benefit of the doubt. I think, that's weird because she's actually a really good person, but what she's saying isn't consistent with that. So that's kind of odd. I need to figure that out. And here's the kicker. If it's neutral, we go ahead and give it a bump up into the positive side. That's all right. She's doing great. After a couple of years, if we're in the power struggle, I'll have a shift where I will sometimes move this person from my mental category of good to my mental category of bad or dangerous or just basically not good. And now the opposite happens. If something comes out of their mouth that's negative, I think, it sounds about right. If something comes out of their mouth that's positive, I think, what's the catch? I understand what's happening here. There's not any trust here. I understand what's really going on. And the kicker, again, if it's neutral, I'm going to go ahead and bump it down into the negative category. When relationships get into that place, things aren't moving in a very good direction, and they usually aren't going to end well unless there's some sort of intervention or change.
I had a friend who went through a divorce, and she was like, one day I just woke up and all of his flaws that I accepted in the beginning, it was like, he had this or he had that, and it was, adorable at the time. She says, one day I just woke up and I was like, like I just, there's, and so I've always kept that with me because I'm like, being married 32 years, it's like, not every day, but it's like that check of like, okay, he's still adorable. Like it's still
Sure.
good. But it's like, that was her trigger. Like when she knew, she woke up and she's like, no, things that I knew he had flaws, like he wasn't Brad Pitt, but when the flaws outweighed the good that I saw in him, that's when I knew that was it. And then you just start picking those flaws apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, so temperature check. Okay, no, we're still good. But so that kind of feeds into what you're saying too.
Yeah. So when we're talking about that, there's a degree to which we can choose to, we sort of choose our partner every day. I can't remember which sort of marital philosopher talks about that, but the idea of waking up and I'm going to choose this person every single day. Choose them for all their good and all their bad. One of the things I'll say to folks when I don't do a lot of couples work, it's not a specialty of mine, And I think you probably should be a specialist to work with couples as a therapist. We come out of graduate school and they tell us that we're sort of prepared to do couples work, and I don't always think that's the case. I think it is, particularly nowadays, there's a lot more research and a lot more opportunities for specialization. So I'll do work with couples who are doing okay and want to get better, but if somebody's on the rocks or really having a hard time, I send them elsewhere. But what I'll say a lot of the time is, the challenge that we have is we have this delusion that the next person will fix us and the next person will be better. And what we discover a lot of the time is that, at first it's true because we go through the falling in love phase, right? So the first couple of years, we're like, this guy's great or this gal's perfect. I'm so glad. But a lot of times relationships follow sort of an interesting pattern, even over the course of years. So I find that when I'm working with couples who are on their second marriage, I say, how long you been married? Oh, about 10 years. And how long your first marriage lasts? Oh, about 12 years. Oh. And I make up some of the time, not always, but some of the time, that there's sort of a predictable pattern in terms of the amount of time before certain characteristics arise. And a lot of times when I'll work with people on their second marriage, they'll come to that realization, and a lot of times they'll stick it out just because, I left last time and ended up back here again. And that's the thing is we tend to, when we end relationships, we bounce into another one, but we take ourselves with us. And we tend to pick people who still have the same flaws. Or we'll pick the opposite set of flaws, right? I'll pick somebody like my mom, and that doesn't work out, so I divorced her, and then I pick a woman who's more like my dad in terms of disposition and character. But I'm still me, and I still end up in a challenge. And then I say, and now there's 4 crazy people raising your kids instead of just 2.
Right.
Right? And you no longer have an influence over half of that process. So that's exciting.
That's great, because that's going to continue to just make problems on both sides. But
it's hard.
Well, and it's weird because I normally hear, people are divorced after, 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
It's pretty common.
You don't usually hear, unless, we stay together for the kids. But usually if you can make it past that, 15 years, it's like, it just would be ridiculous for me to go, oh, we're getting a divorce now. We've stuck it through for 32 years. But,
Sure.
He didn't take out the trash again.
Damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and there is really a certain degree to which, in my own experience, just personally, I've run into people who are older and who stayed married for a long time, 40, 50 years, whatever. And you walk up to them and you say, how'd you do it? And the honest ones say, we just did it.
We
just didn't get a divorce. we just didn't stop.
Yeah. Well, and I look at my friends who, most you see a lot of what they post on Facebook and Instagram, and then you see that, oh, we're getting a divorce. It's like, what, really? Because on here, it's like, it was perfect. But I think it's, people are always with me, it's like, gosh, how do you, because it's 32 years and we're still in love, and it's great and butterflies and rainbows. But, I look at a lot of people that just go through the motions.
Sure.
It's just, we do different things, they're on 2 different paths, and it's just like, they'll, it's just, it's cheaper to keep her, maybe. That's a good old saying. Just kidding.
Well, that's a thing too. Marriage can end up being pretty bland and dry sometimes too. Yeah. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that's related to some of our early childhood experiences and some of the wounds that are coming up, unmet needs, and on both sides generally. Yeah. And with some work, a lot of times it can be resolved. It's just a matter of what work. The work is different with each couple every time. And a lot of times, if things are really stale or been really bad for a long time, there's some childhood trauma that is getting in the way either. And sometimes people are aware of that, and sometimes they're not.
So to save the fact that we came into this with love, we're talking about love.
Yes. Love is great.
It is one of those things, because I'm like, you and I tend to go down that rocky little path, but it's like, that's so much, that's society, right? But so, it is, if you're thinking about divorce or you're thinking about doing, remember that cycle. And can this be fixed, or is it something that I'm just going to continue repeating the cycle? It bothers me when you say that, you pick somebody that's like your mom, because my mother-in-law, That makes me nervous. Like,
Oh.
so if you look at that, do I look at that and go, oh, gosh, he picked me because I remind him of his mom, or,
Well, the reality of it is a little more complex than that. We really take, it looks like we probably pick people who have a compilation of the characteristics, both good and bad, of both of our parents. Like we create, Hendricks talked about the idea of the imago, which was a fancy way of saying this sort of idealized, fictionalized person in my head who would be my ideal partner. And now there's the conscious version of that, which is heavily influenced by media, and the unconscious version of it, which is heavily influenced by my observations of who my parents were, particularly from the ages of 0 to 6. And it's also going to be influenced by various forms of trauma. And so all those things kind of coalesce into an incredibly complicated, probably ineffably complex process. But you can tell that the process is very specific because you'll be hanging out with a friend and somebody will walk in the room and your heart will flutter and your friend will be like, nah, no thanks. So two people can look at the exact same person. You mentioned Brad Pitt earlier, right? So sort of a universal sex symbol kind of guy. But if you sit down with Brad Pitt and get to know him, there'd be different levels of excitement about that, depending on a person's past experiences and what they're looking for, both consciously and unconsciously, even primarily unconsciously. Our capacity to pick out people who resemble and recreate some of the difficult and beautiful, but the difficult are the part we notice, elements of our childhood is really remarkable. Our capacity to find out somebody, to sniff out somebody who looks, smells, and acts a lot like our family of origin did is pretty amazing. Yeah. There's a lot happening there.
It's crazy because I remember the first time I saw my husband, I was like, that's him. Boom. I knew it. And so, people, love at first sight. It's not true. For me, definitely true. It was like, that was it. I mean, went down other paths here and there, but it always came back to him. And that was just it's still the weirdest thing to me. Like, how did, and we were married young, but it was like, how did I know? Like, how did I know this was my person? Because, I mean, he's cute, but, It was just, I just knew that was my guy and that's it. So, and still to this day, that's my guy. But it's just astonishing to me how we're attracted to people and how that you just know that that's your person. And
sure,
and he's like, oh, I was never one with a lot of girlfriends. I'm like, I don't understand because the universe knew. So that was, so do you believe in soulmates?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's kind of outside the realm of my profession for sure.
Yeah. So
I do think there is a degree to which I think, we will be more successful in relationships if we use them as a workshop to work out our own challenges and our pain versus, the concept of a soulmate is that somebody's going to come along who's going to complete me, a la Jerry Maguire. And it was so interesting that particular line in that particular movie became just really imbued in the culture. And it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. I can think of Austin Powers, the Austin Powers movie where Dr. Evil says, "You complete me."
With the baby, yes.
You complete me.
Mini-me.
So there was tongue-in-cheek pieces to it, but there was something, that movie made $1 bajillion at the box office and did really well. And there was something about that line and that experience that rang kind of an archetypal, deep piece of the human, maybe particularly the American psyche. And so the idea that I'm going to find somebody who's going to fulfill me and make me happy and bring me joy, I think is responsible for a fair amount of heartache.
Right.
Marriage and partnerships, what my partner can do is hold up a mirror that's pretty clear. My wife knows me probably better than I know myself. Particularly, my wife is able to see the things about myself that I would prefer not to see. And in most marriages, your partner can see things you'd prefer not to see, and sometimes can't help but see those things, right?
Right.
And so it's an opportunity for all of us to grow and to move toward becoming more of who we're supposed to be. That's probably a more viable model for creating relationships versus the idea of a soulmate and somebody who's put out there for me. It does, it does seem interesting. Same thing though, when we talk about this "you complete me" thing having such a hold in the culture, the soulmate thing certainly has a hold in the culture. I mean, that's
everybody believes that, right? There's somebody out there for everybody.
And so you'd think that there must be, I place a lot of, I prefer to give the benefit of the doubt to things that have withstood the test of time within a culture and within, so it might be interesting to look at. But no, I don't. So I guess I don't have a strong opinion on the soulmate side of things, other than to say, I think the idea of a relationship being, I had a friend who said, a marriage is like taking two pieces of sandpaper and rubbing them together. It's a little gnarly to begin with, but eventually the rough edges get smoothed out. Yeah. And I think that's probably more the philosophical direction I would go.
Because I think about the soulmate, and it's like that might be, or that love at first sight, that's what gets you there, but it has never been, easy. Marriage is not for the faint of heart, for sure.
Not typically.
No.
There are, once in a while, you run into people for whom it's easy, at least for a season.
Yeah.
If they just happen to be compatible.
Do you recommend premarital counseling?
Oh, sure. You can't ever get too much information about the other person. What I will say is, I know in my own experience, I thought premarital counseling would, I have a master's degree that's basically focused on relationships, right? And so I thought, well, I have this master's degree. My wife actually is a therapist also. And we thought, well, geez, we read all the books. Perfect. We got it figured out. And so I thought premarital counseling and knowing a lot about marriage would be the same as being married and would save me a lot of trouble and hassle and heartache. But it turns out that was not true. No. Because apparently I am a bit of a pain in the ass to be married to, is what I'm told. That's the rumor. I don't see it myself, but
I'll have to ask your wife.
I certainly have been told that there have been some challenges that way. And those challenges, they get worked out. They get worked out in the moment. And there's a lot of conflict and a lot of challenges that show up, and that's how we do it. That's how we grow.
Well, it's work.
It's work.
Love is work. First 2 years, fun and easy. Ride the high for as long as you can, and then get to work, right?
Yes, that's it.
All right. Well, I
so happy spring, everybody.
Happy spring. Go find love. Get a shot of dopamine.
Go find love. Thing. Go enjoy
Go find love.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, covered that little chunk of the family dynamic. I know there's
fun.
More. There's more.
There's always more.
Yeah. Well, can't wait to see what we find out next week. Exciting. If you guys have questions, write them in. If you believe in love at first sight, if you believe in soulmate, let us know, because it's, love to let you know that it's true.
Absolutely.
Science, soulmates. But I thought this was great. I just kind of a little different, kind of completing that family segment and kind of putting all that together. And then who knows where we go next week. And it's always a pleasure having my favorite guy, Greg Struve, in here.
Thanks.
And from Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. And if you guys are, it's spring. You're either falling in love, trying to find love, falling out of love, whatever it is. If you need to talk to somebody, if things are a little rocky or going great, but you just want to go over, just anything. These are the guys to talk to. You guys are the pros. And, I recommended you to a mom the other day who's just
fun.
I just don't know what to do with this kid. And she needs somebody to talk to. And, wouldn't have known to do that, unless since I met you, I'm like, these are the guys. You're so easy to talk to, and you make it super, and things that are, you're a mind reader. You already know what's going on in here, and it's just great to have that, reflection and to be able to bounce, stuff off you. So, if you've got an issue or problem, Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare, is there a good number for them to call or a good website?
Yeah, just granitemountainbhc.com.
Awesome.
It's in behavioral healthcare, BHC. And I'm glad you're enjoying it. I'm enjoying it too.
I am too. This is great. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to Cast 11 Podcast, Power of the Mind. We will see you next week.
If you have a question or something you'd like us to discuss here on Power of the Mind, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is stories, STORIES, @ signalsaz.com. signals.com. That's stories, STORIES, at signals, SIGNALS, AZ.com. Look forward to hearing from you.